The sound of breaking glass cut through the humid California air like a gunshot, and Katie Freeman knew her father had started drinking again before the sun even reached its peak in the sky over Winnetka. It was August 1882, and the heat pressed down on the small mining town with relentless fury, baking the wooden buildings and turning the dusty streets into rivers of fine powder that coated everything it touched. Katie stood behind the bar of the Silver Dollar Saloon, her dark auburn hair pinned up in a practical bun, sweat beading on her forehead as she wiped down glasses that never seemed to get completely clean. At 22 years old, she had been working in her father's establishment since she was old enough to reach the counter, and every day felt like another link in a chain she could never break. The saloon doors swung open, and a figure stepped inside, momentarily silhouetted against the blazing sunshine before the doors settled back into place. Katie glanced up from her work, her green eyes adjusting to see a tall man removing his dusty hat and slapping it against his thigh. Dirt cascaded to the floor in a small cloud. He was lean and broad-shouldered, with sun-darkened skin and dark hair that curled slightly at the ends where it touched his collar. His eyes, she noticed as he approached the bar, were an unusual shade of blue, almost gray in the dim light of the saloon. "Water, please," he said, his voice rough but polite. "Been riding since dawn." Katie nodded and reached for a clean glass, filling it from the pitcher she kept cool in the cellar. The man's hands, she noticed as she set the glass before him, were calloused and strong, the hands of someone who worked hard for his living. He drank deeply, draining the glass in 3 long swallows, then set it down with a grateful sigh. "Much obliged," he said, meeting her eyes. "Name's Jack Oliverson. Just signed on as foreman at the Copper Ridge Mine." "Katie Freeman," she replied, refilling his glass without being asked. "This is my father's place." Jack glanced around the saloon, taking in the worn furniture, the bar that had seen better days, and the faded paintings on the walls. "Been here long, all my life," Katie said, and she could not keep the weariness from her voice. "Born upstairs, probably die upstairs." Something in her tone made Jack look at her more closely. But before he could respond, a crash came from the back room, followed by her father's slurred cursing. Katie's jaw tightened, and she set down the glass she had been holding with more force than necessary. "Excuse me," she muttered, already moving toward the back. She found Thomas Freeman sprawled on the floor of the storage room, an empty whiskey bottle rolling away from his outstretched hand. At 58, he looked 20 years older, his face bloated and red, his eyes bleary and unfocused. Katie had long since stopped feeling sympathy for him. Her mother had died when Katie was 12, worn down by years of her husband's drinking and gambling, and Katie had spent the last decade keeping the saloon running while her father drank away whatever profits they managed to make. "Get up," she said flatly, not moving to help him. "Don't you talk to me like that, girl," Thomas slurred, struggling to push himself up. "I'm still your father." "Then act like one," Katie shot back, but she moved forward to help him to his feet anyway. She had learned long ago that arguing with him when he was drunk was pointless. She got him settled in the chair in the corner of the storage room, where he promptly slumped forward and began snoring. When she returned to the bar, Jack was still there, nursing his second glass of water and watching her with an expression she could not quite read. Concern, maybe, or curiosity. Katie felt her face flush with embarrassment. It was one thing for the regular customers to know about her father's condition. They had all seen him stumble and fall, had all heard him ranting and cursing. But having a stranger witness, it felt different somehow, more shameful. "I should get going," Jack said after a moment. "Need to report to the mine before afternoon shift change, but I'll be back. This seems like the best place in town for a drink. Or water, apparently, Katie said, attempting a smile. Jack grinned, and it transformed his face, making him look younger and more approachable. That too. Thank you, Miss Freeman. He placed a coin on the bar, more than enough to pay for the water, tipped his hat, and walked out into the blazing afternoon. Katie watched him go, then picked up the coin and tucked it into her apron pocket. The rest of the day passed slowly, as days in the saloon always did. A few miners came in after their shifts ended, drinking beer and playing cards at the corner tables. Katie served them mechanically, her mind elsewhere. She thought about Jack Oliverson's kind eyes and gentle manner, then pushed the thoughts away. Men came and went in Winnetka. They worked the mines until the ore ran out, or they got hurt, or they found somewhere better to be. Getting attached to any of them was foolish. But Jack came back the next day, and the day after that. He always ordered water first, drinking it down before switching to a single beer that he nursed for an hour while reading a newspaper or chatting with the other miners. He was friendly but not overly familiar, respectful in a way that set him apart from many of the rough men who frequented the saloon. And he always made sure to say goodbye to Katie before he left, his blue-gray eyes lingering on her face as though he were trying to memorize it. 2 weeks after their first meeting, Katie was closing up the saloon late one evening when she heard shouting from the street. She hurried to the door and looked out to see a group of miners arguing, their voices raised in anger. In the center of the group was Jack, his jaw set and his hands clenched at his sides. "I don't care what Morrison says," one of the miners was yelling, his face red. "We aren't working another 12-hour shift without proper ventilation. 3 men nearly died from the gas last week." "I agree with you, Collins," Jack said, his voice calm but firm. "That's why I already talked to Morrison about it. He's bringing in an engineer next week to assess the situation." "Next week?" another miner shouted. "We're supposed to risk our lives for another week." "I'm not asking you to risk anything," Jack replied. "I'm telling you what I've already done. If you want to take it up with Morrison yourself, that's your right. But threatening to burn down the mine office isn't going to help anyone." The group fell silent at that, and Katie realized with a start that the men must have been planning something violent. She watched as Jack continued talking, his tone reasonable and persuasive, until the tension in the group began to ease. Eventually, the miners dispersed, grumbling but no longer shouting. Jack stood alone in the street for a moment, his shoulders sagging with exhaustion, before turning and walking toward the saloon. Katie quickly stepped back inside and busied herself wiping down the bar, though it was already clean. Jack came through the doors a moment later, looking tired and frustrated. "Rough night?" Katie asked. Jack gave a short laugh. "You could say that. Morrison's cutting corners on safety and the men are at the end of their rope. Can't say I blame them, but violence isn't the answer." "What is the answer?" Katie asked, genuinely curious. "Persistence," Jack said, sitting down at the bar. "Keep pushing, keep demanding better, keep refusing to accept less than what's right. It's slow, but it works." Katie poured him a beer without being asked and set it before him. "You sound like you have experience with that." "My father was a miner," Jack said, taking a sip. "Died in a collapse when I was 16. The mine owners said it was an accident, an act of God, but my mother and I knew better. They hadn't shored up the tunnels properly, hadn't followed basic safety protocols. They just wanted to get the ore out as fast as possible, and they didn't care who got hurt in the process." "I'm sorry," Katie said softly. Jack shrugged, but she could see the pain in his eyes. "It was a long time ago, but it's why I do what I do. I swore I'd never let other men suffer the way my father did if I could help it." They talked for another hour, long past the time Katie should have locked up. Jack told her about growing up in Nevada, about his mother who had worked as a seamstress to support them after his father died, about the years he had spent working his way up from a common miner to a foreman. Katie found herself opening up in return, telling him things she had never told anyone. About her mother's death, about her father's decline, about the suffocating feeling of being trapped in a life she had never chosen. "Why don't you leave?" Jack asked. "You're young, capable, you could find work anywhere." "And leave my father," Katie shook her head. "He'd drink himself to death in a week without me here to manage things. Besides, where would I go? What would I do? This is all I know." "That's not true," Jack said, leaning forward. "You're smart, Katie. You could learn anything you wanted. You could have a different life if you chose it." "Could I?" Katie asked, and there was a challenge in her voice. "Or is that just something people say to make themselves feel better about the fact that some of us are stuck?" Jack held her gaze for a long moment. "I don't know," he said finally, "but I think you deserve the chance to find out." The conversation stayed with Katie long after Jack left that night. She lay in her narrow bed upstairs, listening to her father snore in the room next door, and imagined a different life. A life where she woke up in a clean house that belonged to her, where she spent her days doing work she chose, where she came home to someone who loved her and treated her with kindness. It seemed like an impossible dream, but for the first time in years, she let herself dream it anyway. Over the following weeks, Jack became a fixture in the saloon and in Katie's life. He came in every evening after his shift, and they would talk for hours about everything and nothing. He told her about the books he had read, the places he had traveled, the dreams he still held for the future. She told him about the town gossip, the strange customers who came through the saloon, the small moments of beauty she managed to find in her daily routine. They laughed together, argued playfully about politics and philosophy, and gradually, without either of them quite meaning for it to happen, fell into something that felt suspiciously like love. Katie tried to guard her heart, knowing that Jack would eventually move on like everyone else did. But he showed no signs of leaving. He threw himself into his work at the mine, fighting constantly with Morrison over safety conditions and fair wages. He earned the respect of the miners and the resentment of the owners. And every evening, no matter how tired or frustrated he was, he came to the saloon to see Katie. It was October when Thomas Freeman finally noticed what was happening. He had emerged from one of his frequent drunken stupors to find Jack sitting at the bar, talking quietly with Katie while she worked. Thomas's bloodshot eyes narrowed, and he staggered over to them. "You," he said, jabbing a finger at Jack. "I know what you're doing. Sniffing around my daughter like a dog in heat." "Father," Katie said sharply, her face flushing with embarrassment and anger. "Don't you father me," Thomas snarled. "I see how you look at him. Think I'm too drunk to notice. I know what's going on." Jack stood slowly, his expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Freeman, I assure you my intentions toward your daughter are entirely honorable." "Honorable?" Thomas spat the word like it was poison. "What does a mine foreman know about honor? You think you're good enough for her. You think I'm going to let some drifter take my daughter away?" "I'm not a drifter," Jack said, his voice still calm but with an edge to it now. "And I wouldn't be taking Katie anywhere she didn't want to go." "Get out," Thomas said, swaying on his feet. "Get out of my saloon and don't come back." Katie felt something inside her snap. She had endured her father's drinking, his rages, his neglect for 10 years. She had kept the saloon running, kept food on the table, kept him alive despite his best efforts to destroy himself. And this was how he repaid her, by trying to drive away the one good thing that had come into her life. "No," she said, and her voice was like ice. Thomas turned to stare at her, shocked. "What did you say?" "I said no," Katie repeated, moving to stand beside Jack. You don't get to tell him to leave. This is as much my saloon as yours. More, actually, since I'm the one who runs it. And if you try to throw him out, I'll leave too." "You're bluffing," Thomas said, but there was uncertainty in his voice. "Try me," Katie said, meeting her father's eyes without flinching. The two of them stared at each other for a long moment, and Katie could see her father working through the calculations in his pickled brain. Without her, the saloon would fail. He knew it, and she knew it. Finally, Thomas looked away, defeated. "Fine," he muttered. "Do what you want. You always have." He turned and stumbled back toward the storage room, leaving Katie and Jack alone. Katie's hands were shaking, and she gripped the edge of the bar to steady herself. Jack reached out and gently covered her hands with his own. "You didn't have to do that," he said softly. "Yes, I did," Katie replied. "I'm tired of being afraid, tired of putting his needs before my own, tired of waiting for permission to live my own life." Jack smiled, that transforming smile that made her heart race. "Good," he said simply. After that night, things changed between them. The tentative friendship they had been carefully maintaining blossomed into something deeper and more undeniable. Jack started walking Katie home after she closed the saloon, even though home was just the stairs at the back of the building. They would stand in the alley behind the saloon, talking in low voices while the stars wheeled overhead, stealing moments of closeness in the darkness. Jack held her hand, touched her face with gentle fingers, and kissed her with a tenderness that made Katie want to weep. She had never been kissed before, had never been courted or romanced. The men in Winnetka saw her as the drunk's daughter, the saloon girl who would be waiting behind that bar until she died. But Jack saw her as something else. He saw her as beautiful, intelligent, worthy of love and respect. And under the warmth of his regard, Katie began to see herself that way too. Winter came to California, bringing cooler temperatures and occasional rain that turned the dusty streets into muddy rivers. The mine continued to operate, and Jack continued his battles with Morrison over working conditions. He won some fights and lost others, but he never gave up. Katie watched him with growing admiration, seeing in him the kind of man she had thought existed only in stories. A man with principles and courage, who fought for what was right even when it cost him. It was December when the accident happened. Katie was serving lunch to a group of merchants when one of the miners burst through the saloon doors, his face pale and his eyes wide with panic. "Cave in at the copper ridge," he shouted. "North Tunnel collapsed. We need everyone who can help." The saloon emptied in seconds, men running toward the mine with whatever tools they could grab. Katie stood frozen for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. Jack worked in the North Tunnel. She had seen him that morning, had watched him walk toward the mine with his lunch pail in hand, had smiled when he turned back to wave at her. If the tunnel had collapsed, if he was trapped, if he was hurt or dying while she stood here doing nothing. She yanked off her apron and ran. The mine was at the edge of town, a sprawling complex of wooden structures and machinery surrounding the dark openings that led into the earth. When Katie arrived, there was already a crowd gathered, miners and townspeople alike, their faces grim. She pushed through them, ignoring the hands that tried to stop her, until she reached the front. The entrance to the North Tunnel was blocked by a mountain of fallen rock and timber. Men were already working to clear it, their movements frantic but organized. Katie scanned the crowd looking for Jack, but she could not find him. Her heart sank. "Miss Freeman," a voice said, and she turned to see Collins, the miner who had argued with Jack that night months ago. His face was streaked with dirt and sweat. "You shouldn't be here. Is Jack in there?" Katie asked, her voice shaking. "Was he in the tunnel when it collapsed?" Collins looked away, and Katie knew the answer before he spoke. "He was, miss. He and 5 other men. We're doing everything we can to get them out." Katie felt the ground tilt beneath her feet, and she would have fallen if Collins had not caught her arm. "How long?" she managed to ask. "How long will it take?" "I don't know," Collins said honestly. "Could be hours, could be days. Depends on how much rock came down and whether the tunnel is still stable." Katie nodded numbly. "I'll wait," she said. "Miss Freeman, I'll wait," she repeated more firmly this time, and she did. She stood at the edge of the crowd as the hours passed, watching the men work, praying to a God she was not sure she believed in anymore. "Please," she thought, "please let him be alive. Please let him come back to me. I will do anything, give up anything, just please let him live." The sun set, and the workers brought out lanterns to continue their efforts. More men arrived from other mines and from neighboring towns, drawn by news of the disaster. They worked in shifts, hauling away rock and shoring up the unstable sections with timber. Katie heard them talking in low voices about the possibility of another collapse, about how much air the trapped men would have, about how long a man could survive underground without water. She refused to listen. She focused on the entrance to the tunnel, willing it to open, willing Jack to emerge safe and whole. Her father came looking for her at some point, surprisingly sober and genuinely worried, but she sent him away. She could not deal with him right now. All of her attention, all of her hope, was focused on that dark opening in the earth that had swallowed the man she loved. It was nearly dawn when she heard the shout. "We've broken through. We've reached the chamber." The crowd surged forward, and Katie was carried with them, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. She watched as the first miner emerged from the tunnel, blinking in the lamplight, his face haggard but alive. Then another and another. 4 men came out, coughing and stumbling, immediately surrounded by relieved family members and friends. But there was no sign of Jack. Katie felt her hope begin to crumble, felt the cold certainty of loss settling over her like a shroud. And then, finally, 2 more figures appeared at the mouth of the tunnel. One was being supported by the other, his arms slung over the taller man's shoulders. Even covered in dust and blood, Katie recognized Jack immediately. She did not remember running to him. One moment she was standing with the crowd, and the next she was in front of him, her hands reaching for his face, his arms, his chest, needing to feel that he was real and solid and alive. "Katie," Jack said hoarsely, and his voice was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. "What are you doing here?" "I've been here all night," she said, and she was crying now, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her face. "I thought you were dead. I thought I'd lost you." Jack's good arm came up to wrap around her, pulling her close despite the pain it clearly caused him. "I'm all right," he murmured into her hair. "Broken ribs, maybe, and some cuts, but I'm all right. I'm here." The doctor arrived then, insisting on examining the injured men. Jack's diagnosis was as he had guessed: 3 broken ribs, numerous bruises and contusions, and a deep gash on his left arm that required stitching. But he was alive, and he would heal. Katie stayed by his side through it all, holding his hand while the doctor worked, ignoring the disapproving looks from some of the townspeople who thought it was improper for an unmarried woman to be so forward. She did not care what they thought. She had almost lost Jack, and the experience had burned away all of her fears and reservations. She loved him. She wanted to spend the rest of her life with him, and she was not going to waste another moment pretending otherwise. When the doctor finally finished and pronounced Jack fit to go home, Katie helped him to his feet. He was staying in a boarding house on the other side of town, a long walk for a man with broken ribs. But he insisted he could make it, and Katie walked beside him, ready to catch him if he stumbled. They were halfway there when Jack stopped, breathing hard, his face pale with pain. "I need to rest," he admitted. They sat down on the steps of the general store, closed at this early hour. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Katie sat close to Jack, her shoulder pressed against his, drawing comfort from his warmth and his presence. "I was scared," Jack said after a moment. "When the tunnel came down, when I realized we were trapped, I was terrified. Not of dying, exactly, but of dying without telling you something important." Katie looked at him, her heart beginning to race again. "What?" Jack turned to face her, his gray-blue eyes intense despite the exhaustion in his face. "That I love you, Katie Freeman. I have loved you since the first moment. I walked into that saloon and saw you standing behind the bar, looking like you carried the weight of the world on your shoulders. I love your strength and your kindness and your sharp wit. I love the way you take care of everyone around you even when no one takes care of you. I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving it to you every single day." Katie felt fresh tears spilling down her cheeks, but these were tears of joy, not fear. "I love you too," she whispered. "I was so afraid I'd never get to tell you that." Jack smiled, that beautiful smile that transformed his whole face, and leaned forward to kiss her. It was a gentle kiss, tender and sweet, full of promise and hope. When they pulled apart, Katie rested her forehead against his, breathing in the scent of him beneath the dust and sweat. "We should get you home," she said finally. "You need to rest." "I need to do something first," Jack said. He stood slowly, wincing, and offered her his hand. "Come with me." They walked through the waking town, past businesses opening their doors and people beginning their daily routines. Several townspeople called out to Jack, congratulating him on surviving the cave-in, asking how he was feeling. He answered them briefly but kept moving, his destination clearly fixed in his mind. When Katie realized where they were going, her heart skipped a beat. The Silver Dollar Saloon stood quiet in the morning light, its doors closed. Jack led her inside, where her father was sitting at one of the tables, staring morosely at an empty glass. Thomas looked up when they entered, his eyes widening at the sight of Jack's injuries. "Good God, man," Thomas said. "You look half dead." "I feel half dead," Jack admitted. "But I needed to come here. I needed to ask you something, Mr. Freeman." Thomas looked between Jack and Katie, and understanding slowly dawned on his face. "I see," he said quietly. Jack moved to stand in the center of the saloon, and Katie followed, her hand still held in his. The morning light streamed through the windows, illuminating the dust motes floating in the air. Jack took a deep breath, winced at the pain in his ribs, and then slowly, carefully, lowered himself to one knee. Katie's hand flew to her mouth. She heard footsteps on the porch outside and realized that people were stopping to look through the windows. The news of Jack's cave and survival had spread through town, and people were curious about what the battered foreman was doing at the saloon so early in the morning. Within moments, the saloon began to fill with people. Miners still covered in dust from the rescue effort, merchants opening their shops, women on their way to market. They crowded inside, drawn by curiosity and by the sense that something important was happening. The room fell silent, every eye fixed on the man kneeling in the center of the floor. "Katie Freeman," Jack said, his voice rough but steady, carrying clearly in the hushed room. "I know I'm not much. I'm a mine foreman with broken ribs and maybe $50 to my name. I can't offer you wealth or an easy life, but I can offer you my heart, my loyalty, and my promise to love you and honor you for as long as I draw breath. Will you marry me?" The saloon went absolutely silent. Katie could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her. She looked at Jack, at this brave, kind, principled man who had fought his way out of a collapsed mine and immediately come to propose to her. She thought about the life she had been living, trapped in her father's saloon, drowning in obligations and responsibilities that were never truly hers. She thought about the life Jack was offering, uncertain and challenging but full of love and possibility. And then she thought about what she had learned in the long night of waiting for him to emerge from that tunnel. Life was short and precious and unpredictable. You could not wait for the perfect moment or the perfect circumstances. You had to seize happiness when you found it, hold it close, and never let go. Katie looked around at the assembled crowd, at their expectant faces, and felt a smile spreading across her own face. She turned back to Jack, still kneeling despite the obvious pain it caused him, and spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you, Jack Oliverson, today if possible." The saloon erupted in cheers and applause. People surged forward to congratulate them, to clap Jack on the back and embrace Katie. Someone produced a bottle of whiskey and began pouring drinks. Someone else ran to fetch the preacher. The quiet morning transformed into a celebration, spontaneous and joyful. Katie helped Jack to his feet, supporting him as the well-wishers crowded around. She looked for her father and found him still sitting at his table, watching the scene with an unreadable expression. Their eyes met across the room, and Katie saw something in his face she had not seen in years. Resignation, perhaps, or acceptance, maybe even a trace of happiness for her. Thomas Freeman stood slowly and made his way through the crowd to where Katie and Jack stood. Up close, he looked older than Katie had ever seen him, his face lined and haggard. But his eyes were clear, and when he spoke, his voice was steady. "Take care of her," he said to Jack, offering his hand. "She's a better person than I ever was." Jack shook his hand firmly. "I will, sir. I promise you that." Thomas turned to Katie then, and for a moment neither of them spoke. There was too much history between them, too many years of pain and resentment and disappointment. But there was also love, buried deep beneath all the rest. He was still her father, and she was still his daughter. "Be happy, Katie girl," Thomas said gruffly. "That's all I ever wanted for you, even if I had a poor way of showing it." Katie felt tears stinging her eyes again. She leaned forward and kissed her father's weathered cheek. "Goodbye, Pa," she whispered. "Not goodbye," Thomas said. "I'll still see you around town." "But yes, this is an ending, I suppose, and maybe a beginning for you." The preacher arrived an hour later, roused from his breakfast by the excited messenger. He was a kind-faced man named Reverend Michaels who had known Katie since she was a child. When he heard what was needed, he smiled broadly and agreed to perform the ceremony immediately. Katie looked down at her dress, dusty and wrinkled from the long night at the mine. "I should change," she said. "I can't get married looking like this." "You look beautiful," Jack said softly. "You always look beautiful to me." But several of the women in the crowd insisted on helping her, whisking her upstairs to her small room. They brought a basin of clean water and helped her wash the dust and tears from her face. Mrs. Chen from the boarding house produced a lovely blue dress that she said would fit Katie perfectly, and a ribbon for her hair. The women worked quickly, chattering excitedly about the romance of it all, the mine foreman and the saloon girl, the proposal in front of the whole town. When Katie came back downstairs, 20 minutes later, the saloon had been transformed. Someone had pushed the tables aside to create an open space in the center. Someone else had found flowers, bright California poppies that added spots of orange and gold to the rough interior. The miners had cleaned themselves up as best they could, and more townspeople had arrived, drawn by the news of the impromptu wedding. Jack stood at the front of the room beside Reverend Michaels, and when he saw Katie, his face lit up with such love and wonder that Katie felt her knees go weak. She made her way to him through the crowd, her hand clasped by Colin's, who had volunteered to walk her down the makeshift aisle since her father was in no condition to do so. The ceremony was short and simple, the words familiar, but made new by the emotion behind them. Katie repeated her vows in a clear voice, promising to love and honor and cherish. Jack did the same, his voice breaking slightly with feeling. When Reverend Michaels pronounced them husband and wife, Jack kissed her gently, mindful of his injuries but unable to hide his joy. The celebration lasted the rest of the day. The saloon stayed open, with Thomas Freeman surprising everyone by serving drinks on the house. Someone produced a fiddle, and there was dancing, the miners whirling their partners around the floor with more enthusiasm than grace. Katie danced with Jack, moving slowly and carefully so as not to hurt his ribs, feeling like she was floating. As the sun began to set, Jack took Katie's hand and led her outside. They walked away from the noise and celebration, down the street to the boarding house where Jack had been staying. His room was small but clean, with a narrow bed and a window that looked out over the town. "It's not much," Jack said, suddenly uncertain. "We'll find somewhere better as soon as we can. A real house with room for a family someday." Katie silenced him with a kiss. "It's perfect," she said. "Anywhere with you is perfect." They spent their wedding night in that small room, learning each other with gentle hands and whispered words. Jack's injuries made him move carefully, and Katie was nervous, having no experience with intimacy. But they were patient with each other, and what they lacked in skill they made up for in love and tenderness. When Katie finally fell asleep in Jack's arms, she felt safe and cherished in a way she had never experienced before. The next morning brought reality back in force. Jack's injuries kept him from working, which meant no income for the next several weeks. Katie needed to figure out her situation at the saloon, whether she would continue working there or find something else. And they needed to find a more permanent place to live. But they faced these challenges together. Katie went to talk to her father and found him, surprisingly, sober and clear-eyed. They worked out an arrangement where Katie would continue working at the saloon 3 days a week, which would bring in enough money to help while Jack recovered. Thomas even agreed to hire a boy to help with the heavy work, acknowledging that he had relied on Katie for too long. Jack spent his recovery time looking for a house they could afford. Winnetka was still a small town and options were limited, but he finally found a tiny cottage at the edge of town, owned by a widow who was moving in with her daughter. It had 2 rooms, a patched roof, and a garden plot out back, and it was the most beautiful thing Katie had ever seen. They moved in a month after their wedding, carrying their few possessions on a borrowed cart. Jack was healing well, though his ribs still ached in cold weather for years afterward. He returned to work at the mine, and Katie continued her arrangement with the saloon, though she spent more and more of her time fixing up the cottage, making it into a real home. Life settled into a new rhythm. Jack continued fighting for better conditions at the mine, and Katie continued serving drinks and managing her father, who seemed to be trying in his own faltering way to drink less and be better. It was not a dramatic transformation, but it was progress. They had Sunday dinners together sometimes, Jack and Katie and Thomas, awkward at first but growing easier with time. Spring came, and with it, news that made Katie's heart soar. She was pregnant. She told Jack one evening as they sat in their little garden watching the sun set over the town. He pulled her into his arms and held her tight, his face buried in her hair, and she felt him shaking with emotion. "We're going to have a baby," he said wonderingly. "A family of our own." The pregnancy was difficult at times, the California heat oppressive as summer arrived and Katie's belly grew. But Jack was attentive and caring, doing everything he could to make her comfortable. He rubbed her swollen feet in the evenings and brought her cool water during the day. He talked to her belly, telling their unborn child stories and singing old songs his mother had taught him. In October of 1883, Katie gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him James, after Jack's father. He had his father's blue-gray eyes and his mother's auburn hair, and both of his parents fell instantly and completely in love with him. Jack held his son with shaking hands, tears streaming down his face, and Katie watched them with a feeling of such profound contentment that she thought her heart might burst. Thomas Freeman came to meet his grandson and surprised them all by breaking down in tears. "He's beautiful," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Just beautiful, like his mother was when she was born." Katie saw her father trying, really trying to be better. He cut back on his drinking, spending more time managing the saloon and less time drowning in bottles. He carved a cradle for James with his own hands, the wood smooth and lovingly finished. He was not perfect, would never be perfect, but he was making an effort, and Katie chose to appreciate that rather than dwelling on all the years he had failed her. Life continued to unfold. Jack was promoted to senior foreman at the mine after Morrison was finally removed following a series of safety violations. Under Jack's management, the conditions improved dramatically, and the miners worked with renewed energy and loyalty. Katie eventually stopped working at the saloon entirely, focusing on raising James and managing their household. She took in sewing work for extra income and found that she enjoyed it, the quiet creativity of it. When James was 2, Katie became pregnant again. This time, she delivered a daughter whom they named Ruth, after Jack's mother. She had Jack's lean build and serious expression, and Katie's green eyes. James was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to help with everything, and Katie and Jack watched their children with hearts full of love and gratitude. The years passed in a blur of ordinary moments that felt like miracles. James's first day of school, Ruth's first words, family picnics by the creek on Sundays. Jack continued to work at the mine, though he began taking classes at night, learning accounting and business management. He dreamed of eventually moving into mine administration, where he could have even more influence on safety and working conditions. Katie watched her children grow and marveled at the life she had built. She remembered the woman she had been, trapped behind the bar of the Silver Dollar Saloon, unable to imagine any future beyond those walls. And now here she was, in her own home with her own family, living a life full of love and purpose and possibility. Thomas Freeman died when James was 5 and Ruth was 3. He had been sober for nearly 2 years by then, and he passed peacefully in his sleep. Katie mourned him, but it was a complicated grief, tangled up with all the years of pain he had caused. Still, she was grateful that at the end he had tried to make amends, had been a part of his grandchildren's lives, had shown her that people could change, even if imperfectly and belatedly. Jack held her through her grief, steady and strong as he always was. "He loved you," he told her. "In his own flawed way, he loved you and wanted you to be happy." "I know," Katie said, "and I hope he knew at the end that I had forgiven him." They inherited the Silver Dollar Saloon, which Jack promptly sold. The money allowed them to buy a larger house, still in Winnetka, but on a quieter street with a bigger garden. Jack used some of the proceeds to invest in the mine, becoming a part owner. It was a risk, but one that paid off handsomely. The mine continued to produce high-quality copper ore, and under Jack's ethical management, it became known as one of the safest and most productive mines in California. When James was 10 and Ruth was 8, Katie gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl they named Daniel and Grace. Their family felt complete then, the house full of noise and laughter and the beautiful chaos of children. Jack thrived in fatherhood, patient and loving with all his children, teaching them about fairness and hard work and standing up for what was right. James grew to be tall like his father, serious and studious, with a passion for engineering. Ruth was fierce and outspoken, constantly getting into trouble for asking questions her teachers did not want to answer. Daniel was gentle and artistic, always drawing or building something with his hands. Grace was the baby, sweet and charming, able to wrap everyone around her little finger with a smile. Katie and Jack watched them grow with pride and amazement. On quiet evenings after the children were in bed, they would sit on the porch of their house, holding hands and looking out at the stars. "Do you ever regret it?" Jack asked one such evening. "Saying yes to me that day, your life might have been easier if you had chosen differently." Katie turned to look at him, this man who had become her whole world. His hair was starting to gray at the temples now, and there were lines around his eyes from squinting in the sun. But to her, he was as handsome as he had been the day he first walked into the $silver saloon. "Easier," she said. "Maybe, but not happier, not fuller, not more meaningful." "You gave me everything, Jack. A family, a home, a life I could never have imagined for myself. I have never regretted saying yes, not for a single moment." Jack brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "I am the luckiest man alive," he said simply. The years continued to pass. James went away to study engineering at university in San Francisco, writing long letters home about his classes and his plans to design safer mining equipment. Ruth shocked the family by announcing she intended to become a teacher, and then shocked them further by insisting on attending a women's college back east. Daniel apprenticed with a carpenter in town and discovered a talent for furniture making. Grace was still in school, but already showing signs of following in her mother's footsteps, managing the household with an efficiency that both amused and impressed Katie. Jack eventually became the general manager of the Copper Ridge mine, and then the owner when the previous owners decided to sell and retire. Under his leadership, the mine became a model for the industry, with profit-sharing programs for the miners, comprehensive safety training, and fair wages. Men came from all over California to work at Copper Ridge, knowing they would be treated with dignity and respect. Katie continued her sewing business, which had grown over the years into a legitimate dressmaking enterprise. She employed 3 other women and produced beautiful garments that were sought after throughout the region. She loved the work, loved the creativity and craftsmanship of it, loved having something that was entirely hers. Their life was not without challenges. There were financial difficulties during economic downturns, health scares as the children dealt with various illnesses, conflicts and disagreements as any family would have. But they faced everything together, Katie and Jack, their love deepening with each passing year. When Katie turned 45 and Jack turned 47, they celebrated their 23rd wedding anniversary with a party at their home. All of their children came, even James from San Francisco and Ruth from Massachusetts. There were grandchildren now, too, James having married a lovely woman named Helen and produced 2 sons of his own. The house was full of family and friends, of laughter and music and joy. Katie stood in the doorway, watching the celebration, and felt Jack's arm slip around her waist. She leaned into him, this man who had saved her, who had loved her, who had built a life with her that exceeded her wildest dreams. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" Jack asked, smiling down at her. "For walking into that saloon 23 years ago. For seeing something in me worth loving. For asking me to marry you in front of the whole town. For every day since." Jack pulled her closer. "Katie Oliverson," he said, using the name that still gave her a thrill of pleasure even after all these years. I would do it all again in a heartbeat. Every moment with you has been a gift." They kissed then, in the doorway of their home, surrounded by the family they had created and the life they had built together. And Katie thought about that young woman standing behind the bar of the Silver Dollar Saloon, dreaming of escape, dreaming of something better. She wished she could go back and tell that woman what the future held. Tell her that the dusty cowboy who would walk through the doors asking for water was her destiny, her salvation, her greatest love. Tell her that sometimes, when you are brave enough to say yes, brave enough to choose love over fear, life can become more beautiful than you ever imagined possible. The years continued to roll on, bringing changes as they always did. Ruth married a fellow teacher, a kind man who supported her ambitions and her causes. Daniel opened his own furniture shop in Winnetka, creating pieces of such beauty and craftsmanship that people traveled from miles away to commission work. Grace attended college and became a nurse, dedicated to helping others in the same fierce, determined way she approached everything. More grandchildren arrived, filling the house with noise and chaos during holidays. Jack eventually retired from active management of the mine, turning over day-to-day operations to James, who had returned to Winnetka after completing his studies. The younger generation was taking over, and Jack was content to step back, spending his days in the garden or reading in his favorite chair, or taking long walks with Katie through the town they had called home for so many years. They grew old together, their hair turning white, their steps slowing. But the love between them never dimmed. If anything, it grew stronger, tempered by decades of shared experiences, of weathering storms together, of building a life brick by brick and memory by memory. Katie sometimes thought about her father, about the Silver Dollar Saloon, about the person she had been before Jack changed everything. It felt like another lifetime, almost like it had happened to someone else. She had been so lost then, so trapped and hopeless. And now look at her life. Look at what love had done, what choosing happiness and bravery had created. On their 40th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a grand party. The entire town seemed to be there. 3 generations of miners who had worked under Jack's management, women who had bought dresses from Katie's shop, friends and neighbors who had been part of their lives for decades. There were speeches and toasts, stories and laughter, and a few tears. Jack stood to speak, his hand trembling slightly but his voice still strong. 40 years ago, he said, I walked into the Silver Dollar Saloon and met a woman who changed my life. I was just a drifter with a broken past and an uncertain future, but Katie saw something in me worth believing in. She took a chance on me, and I have spent every day since trying to be worthy of that chance. He turned to Katie, his eyes shining with love and tears. You have given me everything. A family, a home, a purpose. You have made me a better man than I ever could have been without you. And if I had 1,000 lifetimes, I would choose to spend every one of them loving you. Katie stood and went to him, taking his weathered hands in her own. You saved me, she said simply. You walked into that saloon and offered me a life I had never dared to dream of. And every day since, you have proven that dreams can come true, that love is real, that happily ever after is possible if you are willing to fight for it. They kissed, to the cheers and applause of their family and friends, and Katie felt the same flutter in her heart she had felt on the day Jack first proposed, when the saloon had gone quiet and everyone waited for her answer. She had said yes then, and she would say yes 1,000 times over. Yes to love, yes to life, yes to every adventure and challenge and beautiful moment they had shared. The party continued late into the night, but eventually, Katie and Jack slipped away, walking hand in hand back to their house under a sky full of stars. It was a warm California night, the air soft and fragrant with the scent of flowers from Katie's garden. They sat on the porch swing that Jack had built years ago, the wood smooth from decades of use. Katie rested her head on Jack's shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. "Do you remember the day we met?" Katie asked softly. "Every detail," Jack said. "You were standing behind that bar, looking tired and sad, and I thought you were the most beautiful woman I had ever seen." "I thought you were just another drifter," Katie admitted. "Someone who would be gone in a week. I never imagined that we would have this," Jack finished. 40 years, 4 children, 8 grandchildren and counting, a life full of love and purpose and meaning." "It's been a good life," Katie said. "The best life," Jack agreed. "And it's not over yet. We still have time, you and I, more memories to make, more adventures to have." Katie smiled, feeling the truth of his words. They were old now, yes, but not finished. There was still life left to live, still joy to be found in each day, still love to share with each other and with the family they had built. They sat together on that porch swing, watching the stars wheel overhead, listening to the sounds of the night, feeling grateful for every moment they had been given and every moment still to come. Inside the house, their children and grandchildren were settling in for the night, filling the rooms with warmth and life. This was their legacy, Katie thought. Not just the mine or the business or the house, but this family, these people who loved each other and supported each other and would carry on their values into the future. She thought about the young woman who had stood behind the bar of the Silver Dollar Saloon, trapped and hopeless. She wished she could reach back through time and tell her, "Hold on. Be brave. Your life is about to change in ways you cannot imagine. A man with blue-gray eyes and a kind smile is coming. He will ask you to take a chance, to choose love, to say yes to a future you never thought possible. And when he asks, say yes. Always say yes, because that single word, spoken in a saloon full of witnesses on a warm October morning in 1882, had led to everything. To this house, this family, this beautiful life. To 40 years of love and partnership and shared dreams. To becoming the person she was always meant to be. Jack squeezed her hand gently, and Katie squeezed back, a wordless communication that said everything that needed to be said. "I love you. I am grateful for you. I would choose you again and again and again." As the night deepened and the stars grew brighter, Katie and Jack remained on their porch swing. Two souls who had found each other against all odds and built something lasting and true. The years had taken their toll on their bodies, but their love remained as strong and vital as the day Jack had knelt in that saloon and asked her to be his wife. And Katie, who had once believed herself condemned to a life of quiet desperation, now knew the truth. That love could transform everything, that courage could change your fate, and that sometimes the best adventures began with the simple act of saying yes. Their story would be told for generations in Winnetka, becoming the stuff of legend. The tale of the cowboy who survived a mine collapse and immediately proposed to the saloon keeper's daughter. The brave woman who said yes in front of the whole town. The couple who built a life on love and principle and unwavering commitment to each other. But for Katie and Jack, it was never a legend or a story. It was simply their life, lived one day at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of love at a time. And as they sat together under the California stars, their hands clasped and their hearts full, they knew that they had found what so many people spent their whole lives searching for. They had found home. They had found purpose. They had found love that would last not just until death did them part, but beyond, into eternity, a love that would echo through their children and grandchildren and all the generations yet to come. And it had all started with a simple question asked in a quiet saloon, and an equally simple answer that changed everything. Yes,